listening to Big World Network.
Just Kill Me, Season 3, Episode 6, Answers. Written by Wendy Herman. Read by Wendy Herman. My father had managed to find some beer in his fridge, and we were all enjoying the calming effect of fermented hops when I finally decided on my first question. Were you really at my wedding? An odd choice, I admit, but I had to get the random ones out of the way before I could focus on the big stuff. Yes, I was. Your mother sent me an invitation. I stayed out of sight, but I didn't miss a moment. You looked so beautiful, but... He stopped, reconsidering what he was about to say. But what? I pushed. He took a deep breath and decided to spill it. I never liked that Trevor. There was always something off about him. I wanted to tell you not to marry him, but your mother wouldn't let me. Of course, she didn't know what I knew, and I couldn't tell her. He was part of it, wasn't he? He was barely 20 at the time, but he had something to do with the implants. My father closed his eyes and took a few deep breaths. Dad, you said you'd tell us everything. I need to know. He cleared his throat and nodded. He was a brilliant young protege who helped develop the technology. He knew everything there was to know at the time about the human brain and what it is capable of, but he was odd, to say the least. I noticed he took a liking to you right away. He had quite a crush, but you were always with this guy. He gestured to Ty, but not in a menacing way. He chuckled at the memory. How did you ever find each other? Ty and I gave each other a puzzled look. He answered, We were never apart, at least not for long. Trevor was my best friend, since college, since he and Freya got together. He seemed to be trying to string his thoughts together so they made more sense to him. But it wasn't happening. I took his hand in mine. He smiled at me, but I could tell he was having trouble processing it all. What do you mean you were best friends? You hated him, my father exclaimed. Ty perked up at this and leaned toward my father, but kept hold of my hand. When? Well, you only saw him when you were on, if you know what I mean, when your implant had been activated. You wouldn't have remembered anything after you woke up and went back to your mediocre life. Dad, I was trying desperately to figure out how to make all the events line up. I needed the right question. Did the implants fail? On the contrary, they were a resounding success. You two were invaluable to national security. You killed people, I finished for him. He locked eyes with mine. Yes, you were very good at it, both of you. You were quite a team until Ty cut in. Until what? Until all the touchy-feely people in the government decided it was too risky to have you roaming the streets. What does that mean? I asked, growing impatient. I silently wished that all the information I wanted, all the memories I had lost, could be instantly downloaded into my brain, like the machine in Matrix could do. This was taking far too long for my ADD brain. We were given 2 options, he sighed. Terminate you both, or remove the implants and throw you back into normal society. The room was quiet for a moment. The government wanted to have us killed because we were too good at what we did, and what we did was the job they created us to do in the first place. But wait, Ty and I were not dead, and we still had our implants. Or did we? Did they remove the implants? Initially they voted to terminate, but we convinced them it would be easier, less paperwork, if we just turned you both back into normal, boring human beings. Trevor was given the task of removing the implants. Trevor? I repeated, nervous now at what I would find out next. But he couldn't do it. Couldn't or wouldn't? Ty asked, now holding my hand with both of his. He said it was impossible, that you would suffer severe brain damage if he tried to remove them, but he said he could wipe them clean and then deactivate them. We knew the Senate committee overseeing the project would never go for it, so I fudged the paperwork, and as far as they knew, your implants were removed. Wipe them clean? You mean the memories of when we were on, as you called it, were all stored in the implant, and that's why we couldn't remember anything? He nodded and chugged the remainder of his beer, reaching down and picking up another one and cracking it open. This discussion was definitely easier to handle with a little sedative in the system, so I didn't judge. I had to admit the technology was fascinating, even though it had altered my life irrevocably and may have caused me to spend 2 decades with a man I never loved, but it was still incredible to think that I had a device in my head that could turn me into a lethal weapon at the drop of a hat. How did you activate the implants? When we were needed for a mission, how did you turn us on? I asked. Dad raised his eyebrows at me. It was the old cliché phone call and a certain word that would act as a trigger. But cell phones weren't an option back then, and if neither of you were home to answer the phone, well, and what if someone else answered? There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong, so we came up with a plan B if the phone didn't work. He took another swig of beer and then continued, more and more animated as he spoke. Trevor had already programmed the trigger into the implants, so he added voice recognition. It had to be a specific word, but also spoken by a specific person, and only that person could activate you both. And if we couldn't get you by phone, we sent that person to you, physically. Who was that person? Ty asked. Well, it was Trevor. Shit. He was just realizing himself how diabolical Trevor really was. His eyes grew wide as the dark door opened in his mind. Trevor was the only person who could activate us? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Suddenly my head began to pound. Oh, no, you don't, I ordered my brain. I will not check out of this moment. I had a million more questions. After a few seconds, the pounding subsided. We were just his puppets, Ty murmured, staring at the floor. Then he looked up at me, his eyes burning with rage. All these years, he manipulated us, not just with the lies, but he was literally inside our heads. I felt tears well up in my eyes. My strength was waning, right along with Ty's. My father interjected just then. Now, wait a minute. When he deactivated the implants, he assured us the trigger was turned off as well. Did he? The psycho brain scientist assured you. That's reassuring, Jerry. Ty was losing it. I tried to say something to calm him, but I couldn't think of anything. He stood and started to pace the room, as well as he could with all the piles of newspapers. What are you saying? My dad asked, his genuine confusion scaring me a little. He really had no idea to what lengths Trevor had gone to coordinate the life he wanted, but it was all coming together for me. I maintained my gaze on Ty as I spoke. Dad, Trevor didn't turn the implants off. He reprogrammed them. Ty looked at me, his mouth falling open. I knew what his eyes were asking me. Would we ever really know all the damage Trevor had done? How could we? My dad shook his head. What the hell are you talking about? He couldn't have. Someone would have known. And what if they all turned a blind eye, Dad? I turned to him now. Or they were in on it, or he somehow convinced them he had done what he was supposed to do. I know what he's capable of. My dad thought about that for a moment, and then his eyes lit up with revelation. Trevor had money. What? I asked. He had money. His parents had died the year before, and they left him a small fortune. He paid the other scientists off? Ty was coming down from his anger. Maybe. Could Trevor have reprogrammed the implants to give us false memories? He asked. Son, I have no idea. The technology was not my department. I needed to lay it all out, get my ducks in a row, as it were, so I began to think aloud. Trevor somehow made me believe I was in love with him, and he gave Ty the memories of being best friends. But why? Why would he want to be best friends with a man who hated him? And why did he want me? Oh, he fell for you the moment he saw you, Freya, and you were nice to him. I saw the effect it had on him, but I kept telling myself it was an innocent crush. I knew how you and Ty felt about each other. Ty sat down and squeezed my hand as my dad continued. Men like Trevor, well, he didn't get much attention from the opposite sex, until you tried to be his friend. You always wanted to be everyone's friend, and he took it the wrong way. I don't think you noticed, but he confided in me once. What? I responded. What did he say? His real mother had died when he was 10. He'd loved her very much. Then his father remarried a cold woman with whom he could never form a bond. She wouldn't allow it. Then, when they died, well, it all affected him, shaped him. He was a lonely young man who craved attention from nice maternal women, like his mother had been. And he desperately wanted a family to replace the one he'd lost. And you came along, and you were everything he ever wanted, so he said. Dad suddenly clammed up, perhaps thinking he'd said too much, or realizing that he should have seen Trevor as the sociopath he was back then, and maybe he could have saved his daughter the heartbreak she was now going through. He told you that? I couldn't believe the Trevor my dad was describing. Dad, Trevor is nothing like the introverted science nerd you're talking about. He's confident, successful. Hell, until 2 months ago, I thought he was the perfect husband and father. And aside from all the lies, he was perfect. I trailed off, something in my brain opening up. He had been perfect. Too perfect. Of course he was all of those things. After he had you on his arm, you were the one thing he needed to have the life he'd always wanted. Once he had you, he could be whoever he wanted to be. You fit the missing piece in his psyche. It makes sense, psychologically. He reinvented himself to be the Trevor you know. But he's still a lying, crazy bastard who manipulated Freya and made it be part of his life. Ty said this with an eerie calm. Dad smiled at him. Yes, and I'm sorry about that. If I'd known what was going on, I would have done something. He really meant it, and that made me feel even worse. I got the distinct feeling that he was full of regret, this old man who had been my dad 100 years ago. Regret not just about his family, but about a lot of things. I was starting to see how creating the newspapers had been a cathartic process for him, releasing all those memories, good and bad, after keeping them locked up in his brain for so long. I actually felt a little sorry for him, sitting across from him now, and seeing how the life he chose, the life of a covert career with no one to go home to at the end of a long day, had really aged him. The only thing Trevor ever gave me that was real was my boys. I felt the tears rolling down my cheeks and didn't care. I've been meaning to ask you about that, Dad started. They're just fine, and they want to meet you, I said, thinking I was finishing his sentence. No, that's not what I was going to say, but I'm glad they're doing well. Your mother sends me pictures, you know. She's a good woman. You're like her, Freya. No, anyway, I was going to ask who the surrogate father is, if you even know. You didn't go to one of those god-awful sperm banks, did you? I waited for him to start laughing at his own joke, tasteless though it might be, but he didn't laugh. In fact, he looked very serious as he waited for an answer. Dad, what are you talking about? Sweetheart, it's okay. I know about Trevor's condition. He told me about it himself 20 years ago. What condition? Ty was stiffening beside me, as if he was guessing what my dad was going to say. You were his best friend and he never told you? Freya never told you? Dad, I have no idea what you're talking about. Trevor is the boy's father, I swear. Dad opened his mouth to respond, but froze for a second, waiting for his brain to tell him what to say. He seemed very nervous all of a sudden and stood, pacing. I couldn't move while I tried to prepare myself for what I was about to learn. I wagered a guess in my head, but immediately dismissed it. It couldn't be that. Trevor can't be the father, Freya. Why not, Dad? I asked, each word a dagger through my heart. He was born with a deformity in that area, he started, and I frowned at his inability to say the word penis, although I knew full well it was a product of his generation. It was repaired when he was 2, supposed to be an easy fix, but the surgeon cut too deep. Dad, just say it. I had to hear him say it, or I would never believe it. He's sterile, Freya.
You're listening to Big World Network.